I was born addicted to heroin. By the time I turned 17, I'd survived abuse, homelessness, a near-fatal car crash, and betrayal after betrayal. It wasn't until I gave my life to Christ that I finally began to understand what God had been doing all along.
Whether you're seeking true stories, real-life Christian testimonies, uplifting moments, or just a little bit of hope, you can find it here. This is Kingdom Chronicles. Some stories don't begin with a blessing. They begin with heartbreak, abandonment, and pain. But what happens when God steps into that kind of brokenness? I'm going to warn you that this one's pretty heavy, but it's also filled with hope. This journey will change you and remind you that no one is too far gone for God's grace. This is Joseph's testimony.
On December 5th, 1991, a child was born that brought joy to many and pain to others. When I was born addicted to heroin, cocaine, and other intoxicants. My biological father was struggling with alcohol, while my mother was addicted to heroin. At the time of my birth, my older brother was living with a foster family. In the state of Illinois, if a newborn sibling is living with a foster family, the newborn is immediately placed into foster care as well. However, the state did not place me with the family that was fostering my brother. Instead, we were separated into different families. And so begins my story. The married couple that took me home were unable to have children of their own. On June 4th, 1994, my mother passed away from a heroin overdose. I do not have any memories of her appearance, or her voice, or her existence on this earth, except through videos and photographs. But in my heart, she lives. Childhood for me wasn't easy. There was a constant battle between my biological family and the foster family. Through this battle, I was often dragged into the middle. My biological family was granted visitation by the courts, and during those visits they would feed negative comments to me about my foster family. Then, when I would return, I would hear negative comments about my biological family. This went on for years. As one could imagine, having two families put a child into the middle of their dislike for each other isn't easy on a child. I had outbursts. I had fits. I refused to go home. I refused to go to visits. And because my foster parents had never raised a child before, they thought my behavior was abnormal instead of looking deeper into what was causing it. So they took me to doctors, and I was placed on medication to control my behavior, instead of controlling what they were doing. Outside of making that mistake, the foster family did the best they could raising me. And to this day, they continue to be a huge part of my life. Growing up, my foster father taught me how to play baseball, hockey, football, golf, tennis, and a variety of sports. Those experiences taught me things I still use today: teamwork, leadership, being a positive role model, and so much more. As I turned more towards sports and school, the medication started producing more and more side effects. I gained weight, I developed tremors, I drooled, and starting at the age of 8, I began being placed in mental hospitals. To this day, it amazes me how a medical professional can drug a child and keep him locked away, simply because of how he was nurtured, and not because of a chemical imbalance in the brain. Throughout being in and out of numerous hospitals, and being used as a test dummy for multiple medications, I lost close friends. I was bullied in school, my grades dropped, and eventually, I started to hate life. I also grew resentment toward my foster mother. My foster father was often away on business trips, and she was usually the one taking me to the hospitals and doctors. So I blamed her. And over time, I grew to hate her. Maybe some of that hatred came from losing my biological mother before I was old enough to remember her. Even today, I still wonder why I developed those feelings. But through finding God, I have been able to forgive her. and I have started trying to repair the relationship between us. After all of the hospitals, the medications, the loss of friends, and being bullied and made fun of, I decided to make a change. At the age of 14, I decided to go live with my biological father. Like any child, I thought that after being away from his father for so long, I would be greeted with unconditional love. I thought I would be overwhelmed with happiness and affection. But that wasn't the case. I am by no means saying my father neglected me or did not love me, but the expectations that I had for him were never fulfilled. My father didn't change the way he lived his life. Neither did my brother. Maybe I was selfish for thinking they would want to spend more time with me. I don't know. After about a month of living with my father, there was one Friday night where he never came home. That same night, my brother didn't come home either. I had no idea what was going on. And after a while, I started to worry. I called their phones repeatedly. No answer. Saturday came, and they still weren't home. I started calling hospitals, police stations, and I couldn't find them. Later that night, my brother finally came home. Then Sunday night, my father came home. He had spent the weekend with his new girlfriend, and when I told him how worried I had been, it didn't seem like he cared at all. My father now lives with his girlfriend. Not long after that, I decided to move back in with the foster family, and the day I returned, they placed me into another hospital. I stayed with the foster family for another year, but the depression became so bad that I attempted to take my own life, and I started cutting myself. I decided I needed another change, so I moved in with my biological mother's side of the family. I hoped things would be better. When I was 15 years old, my biological grandmother took guardianship over me. My grandmother was one of those tough love grandmothers. She didn't take anything from anybody. She loved collecting things, and because of that, my bedroom consisted of Barbies and Beanie Babies, which I wasn't allowed to touch. The closet was full of her clothes, and there I was, a 16-year-old guy, basically living in a little girl's room. I wasn't allowed to get my driver's license, and my grandmother never really wanted me in the house. Having one job wasn't enough. She wanted me to get another one. While living with her, I was introduced to a Christian church for the first time. My foster parents were Catholic, and in the midst of everything else, I made the varsity baseball team. But after the season ended, prom came around, and my grandmother refused to let me go. Through all of that, I decided to run away. October 15th, 2009. I was a passenger in a car accident. As a result of the accident, I was airlifted from the scene. I was in critical condition. Death was literally a matter of minutes away. My brain had started bleeding and swelling, and I was placed on life support. A craniotomy was performed, where part of my skull was removed to reduce the swelling and bleeding. I woke up 5 days later with no idea what had happened. A day or two later, a detective came into my room. And that's when I learned that the driver of the vehicle, someone I thought was my friend, was wanted by the police for assaulting, beating, and using a taser on a young boy before leaving him duct-taped and left for dead in a hotel room. I was 17 years old, and I had been in the car with him. To this day, I thank God that he never did that to me, even though there were times when I was alone with him. As a result of the accident, I had 64 staples in my head, screws in my skull, and the left side of my face was paralyzed. I was flown back to my grandmother's house, runaway and all.
If stories like this resonate with you and you believe in honest, faith-centered conversations, please consider subscribing to the channel. We'd love for you to be a part of our growing community. Now, let's get back to the story.
When I returned, my high school gave me a choice. I could stay another year and make up for all the missed days, or I could get my GED. I wanted to stay another year, but my grandmother had authority over me, and she refused. So I was forced to get my GED. And after all of that, I was arrested for disorderly conduct against my grandmother, simply for yelling. I didn't swear, I never touched her. There was no physical contact. But there I was, 17 years old, sitting in jail, 1 week before my 18th birthday. At court, my grandmother told the judge that she wanted me to remain in jail on my 18th birthday. And that's exactly what happened. When I was released, I was thrown out of the house, and I became homeless. On March 30th, 2010, I received a settlement from the car accident for $56,000. At 18 years old, I finally got my driver's license. I found an apartment, bought a car, and furnished my home. For the first time, I had a chance to start over. But having a little over $20,000 left, I wanted to be that cool guy with a lot of cash. And the same day I withdrew $17,000, my home was broken into, and it was all gone. The investigation remains open to this day. After that, my money slowly disappeared. Eventually, I had to sell my car just to keep paying my bills. Then I moved to save money, and while I was away for a weekend, my roommate gave his friend permission to drive my vehicle, and he totaled it. Again, I had nothing. And with nothing left, I packed my things and moved to Naples, Florida, where my foster parents were living. When I arrived in Florida, my foster parents allowed me to use their extra car. Soon after arriving, I found a job working at an animal hospital. After a month or so, I moved out of my foster parents' home and into a place with a roommate. A few months later, I met a girl, and we began a relationship together. A month later, I lost my job. But shortly after, I found another position at a different animal hospital. Then, about a month after that, I was given an opportunity to work for a real estate brokerage as a property manager. So I left the animal hospital and took the new job. Things seemed to be getting better. I moved out of my roommate's house and got a place of my own with my girlfriend. And it was during this season that I stumbled across one of the best churches I've ever been a part of, Life Christian Church in Naples. It was there that my faith really started to grow, but I was still in a rough place. I was struggling with marijuana. My relationship was beginning to head south, and at that time, I wasn't fully surrendered to the Lord. My girlfriend and I were engaged, and we were trying to start a family. Then one day, she didn't come home, and I found out that she had slept with a guy she worked with. I was a mess. My life went downhill faster than ever. I turned to marijuana and alcohol to bury the pain, and within 5 days, everything fell apart. A Mustang I had recently purchased was totaled. The brokerage went bankrupt and shut down. The life I had imagined for myself was gone. And then I received a reckless driving charge and lost my driver's license. Again, I was left with nothing. Following the reckless driving charge, I boarded a plane and flew back to my hometown of Bartlett, Illinois. I moved in with a friend, and while I was there, I became completely unmotivated. 80% of my time was spent either laying down or drinking. I didn't even look for a job for 6 months. During that time, I entered another relationship with a girl who truly helped me. She was a blessing in my life, but tension started growing between me and my friend. Eventually, I found a job working for Aflac in Chicago. Things were going all right, but with Aflac being a 100% commission job, income was limited, and I was still struggling with alcohol. So I made another decision. I moved in with my biological aunt, who had recently gotten married. I hoped I could finally get some help. And while living with my aunt, I started making progress. I finished my driving classes. I started accomplishing things again, and I enrolled in college for fire science. Even though my relationship ended, I was heading down a much better road than the one I had been on before. Being new to the area, without a car and without a license, I was limited in where I could work. I eventually found a job at a small family restaurant within walking distance, and not long after that, I received a job at Lone Star Steakhouse, where I still work today. A few months later, my aunt began having marital problems, and at times, I found myself caught in the middle. But while I was working at Lone Star, I met several people my age who were Christians, and through them, I started attending a local church called The Chapel. And it was there that I truly began giving my life to the Lord. Now, some people think that giving your life to the Lord means your life will magically become better, that your problems will disappear. But that wasn't the case for me. Even after giving my life to the Lord, my life was still faced with more troubles. My aunt's husband eventually became physical with my aunt. The police were involved, but no one was arrested. Instead, the police left it up to the state's attorney. The next morning, her husband went to the courthouse, and he filed orders of protection against both my aunt and myself. Even though we were the victims, the judge granted his order. And just like that, I was forced out of the house. And once again, I found myself on the streets. But this time, I didn't turn to alcohol. I didn't turn to depression. I turned to the Lord. And boy, did the Lord help me. A little background. My job had recently changed its policy. Credit card tips were no longer paid out at the end of the night. Instead, they would come on the following week's paycheck, which meant the only money I walked away with each night were cash tips. And in today's world, most people pay with credit cards. I was living in a hotel, and it was costing me $45 a night. Every day I would go into work and pray. I would ask God to help me get through the day. And for 2 weeks straight, every single night, I walked out with just enough cash tips to pay for that night's room. That's not a common occurrence, and I thank God for it. Most servers write "thank you" on the bottom of the receipt, but I always wrote "God bless," because honestly, I only had the Lord to thank for getting me through those days. While living at the hotel, a woman came into my life. She promised to help me by allowing me to stay in her spare room. And when I left the hotel, I discovered that the spare room was occupied by her ex-boyfriend, who was also the father of her daughter. So I slept on the couch. But even though it was only a couch, I was grateful. I asked her what I could do in return, and she told me I could attend a seminar she went to called Life Leadership. I paid $120 for the weekend, and taking off work cost me another $300. While I was there, I began seeing her true colors. And over the next week, I noticed that she lived by using people for her own benefit and taking money from others. Then one Sunday, she came into my work. She handed me a note and a receipt to a hotel room. This woman took most of my belongings, keeping some for herself, moved the rest to a hotel room, paid for one night, which cost more than the hotel I had been staying in before, and then she drove away. And so, my testimony begins. For at one time you were darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. Ephesians 5:8. My testimony isn't a short story, or a story based on one event. It is the story of how, after giving my life to the Lord, my eyes were opened, and I realized that I was no longer living in darkness. God created us in our mother's womb. He formed us with His hands, and He created us in His image. And after giving my life to Christ, I have finally been able to acknowledge that. Not only in the present, but when I look back on my past as well. Before I was saved, I blamed God for all of the bad things that had happened in my life. I constantly asked Him, "Why? Why would you put me into a life filled with hurt and loneliness?" But I was unable to see God's plan, the plan He had for me before I was ever born. As you have read in my story, my life hasn't been picture perfect. I have faced hardships, struggles, and pain. But I don't want you to think that my life has only been filled with hurt and suffering, because that wouldn't be true. I have great memories from my childhood, mostly associated with sports, but also with friends and experiences that I treasure. Understanding the hardships I have faced simply gives a greater impact to my testimony. It shows how far God has brought me and how He has worked throughout my life. Since I have been saved, I have come to understand that God wasn't hurting me. He was giving me the strength to get through the things I faced. And now, I can look at what once seemed negative and see something positive. People might ask, how is losing your mother at such a young age a good thing? How is family tension a good thing? How is being bullied a good thing? How is surviving a car accident a good thing? Those are fair questions. Because my mother died from a heroin overdose, I carry the wisdom to know better, to never touch something that could destroy my life. If she hadn't passed away, who knows? Maybe I would have ended up addicted to heroin myself. Maybe I would have tried it. Maybe it would have killed me. Even though I have no memories of my mother's voice or her face, I can honestly say that she left a positive impact on my life. Before I was saved, I wasn't able to see things that way. I carried anger, hatred, and blame. There were times I hated family members, and there were times when I wanted revenge on the person who sold my mother the heroin that took her life. But now, I have learned to forgive. Maybe that person is no longer alive. Maybe they have experienced tremendous pain themselves. Or maybe they found God. I don't know. But today, I have peace, and I forgive them. Without a doubt, growing up between my biological family and foster family was painful. But that pain has given me wisdom. And because of what I went through, I know what kind of husband and father I want to become. To me, one of the greatest things I can do in life is become an amazing father, an amazing husband, raise a wonderful family, and do good to others. I don't want my children to experience what I experienced. And because of everything I've gone through, I have the wisdom to help prevent that. I want a family strong in faith, a family that loves God, and a family focused on building a successful future. Growing up, God placed me in countless situations that taught me valuable lessons. And I truly believe that if even one thing had happened differently, I might never have learned those lessons. People often ask me, "What can't you do?" And my answer is simple. There isn't anything I can't do. Because God has blessed me with an amazing ability to learn, to observe, and to absorb what I experience. And with Christ giving me strength, I can do anything He calls me to do. There have been countless times God has shown up in my life, but perhaps the greatest example was my car accident. Just surviving it was a miracle. Having 64 staples in my head, part of my skull removed, temporary paralysis, and still being alive. That's a miracle. But what's even more amazing is that the paralysis healed. Today, I have no lasting effects. None. I have seen others who have gone through similar accidents. People who spend the rest of their lives in wheelchairs. People unable to perform simple tasks. People left in vegetative states. And others who never survived. I am so thankful that God intervened, that He placed the right people in the right places, and that I arrived at the hospital exactly when I needed to. Because just a few minutes later, the swelling in my brain could have caused permanent damage or death. Another miracle was what happened after the accident. No one came to visit me. No one came to take me home. My grandmother bought me a plane ticket, and I had to make an 8-hour trip home without pain medication. Throughout that entire trip, I never felt any pain. Not once. Today, I know something. If that accident had never happened, I would not be where I am right now. God saw that I wasn't heading in the right direction, and He stopped that car. He got my attention. And that accident became one of the first steps that eventually led me to surrender my life to Him. For years, I carried around the same question. Why? Why did this happen to me? But over time, I began to see what God was doing, and I began to understand. The night the woman left my belongings in the hotel room, I called my old youth pastor. I had met him years earlier while living with my grandmother in Wisconsin. I called him asking for help, but I knew his situation. He was a new father and didn't have a large home, so I knew I couldn't stay with him. Instead, I asked him if he knew anyone who might be able to help me. He told me that he was leaving the next day for 10 days to attend a Christian music festival called Audio Feed. And without hesitation, I asked him, "What time do you want me at the train station?" Within a few hours of arriving, Sean, myself, and a few friends went to a church in Rochelle, Illinois. And there, I was baptized in the Holy Spirit and fire. During the baptism, I became drenched with sweat, and then an overwhelming sense of peace came over me. The Holy Spirit. When we arrived at Audio Feed, we were hit by one of the worst storms of the year. We all stood together, holding on to a 40 by 70 foot tent and praying. And after the storm passed, we found ourselves on our hands and knees digging trenches to drain the water. Throughout the festival, I encountered numerous miracles and blessings. During the storm, we prayed that no one would be hurt and that the storm would pass. After checking the news and social media, I couldn't find a single story of anyone being injured or killed. There was a young man at the festival who had been homeless for 6 years. During one of the events, he chipped his tooth and misaligned his jaw. He was also struggling financially. I prayed over him, and the next day, he came to me and told me that a complete stranger had paid all of his fines. On the very first phone call, he found a doctor, and that doctor agreed to fix his tooth for free. Not only that, but he had also found a place to stay. That same day, I was baptized by water. When the festival ended, I once again found myself back on the streets. But this time, something was different. I was able to scrape together enough money to stay in a motel while I completed the community service I needed to finish. The location was over 5 miles away. So every day I jogged those 5 miles, worked in the heat, and thanked God every step of the way for giving me the strength to do it. My testimony isn't a short story, and it isn't based on one event. It's a lifetime of experiences, a lifetime of struggles, and a lifetime of seeing God's hand at work. Before I gave my life to Christ, I blamed God. I asked Him why. I thought He was hurting me. I thought He had abandoned me. But now, I see things differently. God wasn't hurting me. He was strengthening me. He wasn't abandoning me. He was preparing me. And He was carrying me even when I couldn't see Him. For years, I lived in darkness. But through Jesus Christ, my eyes have been opened, and I no longer live there. For at one time you were darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. Ephesians 5:8. My life hasn't been perfect. I've experienced loss, rejection, depression, homelessness, betrayal, and pain. But through it all, God has been faithful. And now, I can look back on every hardship and see that He was always there. Even when I didn't understand, even when I questioned Him, and even when I blames Him, He never left. And because of Christ, I know that whatever lies ahead, I can do all things through Him, because He gives me strength.
Joseph's story is one of unimaginable adversity. Now, I'm talking about addiction at birth, a broken family, countless betrayals, and trauma that should have broken him. Yet, through every hospital visit, foster placement, car crash, and moment of hopelessness, God was there, unseen but never absent. Even when Joseph couldn't see it, the Lord was shaping his future through every hardship. He was preserving Joseph, not pushing him. And when Joseph finally surrendered, not only was his heart transformed, but his perspective was too. From seeing his mother's death, not as a curse, but as a warning that saved his own life, to realizing that every painful chapter prepared him to become the father and husband that he really longed to be. Joseph learned that God's plans are often revealed through our scars. His survival alone is a miracle, but his healing, that's where the miracle really began.